I'm Victoria from Biblio Lifestyle, and you're listening to the Reader's Couch podcast, the show that will help you bridge the gap between living a full and busy life to one where you're reading, learning new things, and having fun. Today on the couch, I'm so excited to welcome author Allison Pataki to talk about her novel, Finding Margaret Fuller. Finding Margaret Fuller is a fictionalized account of 19th century feminist Margaret Fuller. The novel begins in 1836 in Concord, Massachusetts, highlighting her relationships with Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. We see Fuller rise to prominence through her work with women's conversation groups, editing the Dial magazine, and working on social reform. She was also the first female foreign correspondent for the New York Tribune, reporting from Europe. So this novel tells the story of an inspiring, trailblazing woman who loved big and lived even bigger. But before we get into the episode, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the show, leave me a 5-star rating, and write me a review if you love the show. Now, if you don't love the show, that's your choice. But if you do love the show, it's a great way for you to support the podcast. Also, we have a new feature where you can text me directly. So let me know what you think about this episode. Let me know if you've read Finding Margaret Fuller. Tell me about the last book you read and loved, or just anything that's top of mind. So click the link at the top of the show notes that says send me a text with your thoughts, and I'll share some of the messages that I receive on air. So thanks in advance. And now onto the episode with author Allison Pataki. Hi friends, welcome again to the Reader's Couch. I'm your host, Victoria Wood, and here on the couch with me to talk about her novel, Finding Margaret Fuller, is author Allison Pataki. Hi Allison, welcome to the Reader's Couch.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yay, I'm so excited to have you. Can't wait to get into the details of the book. But I know it's not your first rodeo. You've published many books before. But how does it feel having Finding Margaret Fuller out there in the world?
Oh, thank you. Yes, you are correct. So Finding Margaret Fuller is my 10th book, but truly each time it is uniquely exciting. I would say the anticipation and the eagerness and the stress, it doesn't actually lessen the more you do it. I would say, if anything, it gets heightened each time. So I am thrilled. This book was 3 years in the making. I absolutely adored researching Margaret Fuller and her genius cluster of Concord, Massachusetts and beyond. I loved her as a woman, as a character, as an inspiring individual, and an unsung heroine from history. So I am thrilled to finally be out there discussing her life story with readers.
Yay, I love hearing that. And I have to say, I had no idea who Margaret Fuller is. She was a completely new to me person, so I was excited to dive into this novel about her. But I want listeners to hear it straight from you before we start to talk more about her and her life. But tell us about your novel. What can readers expect? Essentially, what's your elevator pitch?
Yes, I love hearing that you had no idea who she was, because that is exactly the place I like to begin with readers, because that is always the place from where I begin when I pick my next book topic, when I choose my next historical heroines. I love to write the stories of the forgotten women from history, the women who have been footnoted or sidelined in the forward progression of time, and to pull them from the shadows and put them center stage as the leading ladies in their own life stories. So that is what I'm doing with Margaret Fuller, who was America's forgotten leading lady. We'll just start with that. She was a muse to Ralph Waldo Emerson. She was the inspiration for Nathaniel Hawthorne in crafting the character of Hester Prynne in the iconic Scarlet Letter that we all grow up reading. She was a friend to Henry David Thoreau. She was a role model to Louisa May Alcott. She was a mentor to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and considered the founding mother of the American women's rights movement by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and others. She was a rival and we'll say frenemy of Edgar Allan Poe, and so much more. Her life intersected with all of the great writers and thinkers that we know of as first giving us the American canon of art and literature. And yet we know all of the names of these characters around her. And yet so few people know the full extent of Margaret's life. She was the first female foreign news correspondent. She had this epic life moment in Rome, covering and participating in the Roman Revolution. It's just incredible. First woman permitted to study at Harvard. She led a really big life, and it was the perfect raw material for me to write historical fiction based on her life.
It's always so surprising to me, these women that, again, we know all the people around them, but we have no idea who they are. So it was really interesting to just see you unfold all of that. I want us to start when she received the job to be an editor. Emerson offered her the job. Let's start there. It was with The Dial. It's based out of Concord, Massachusetts. Tell us about that early time in her life.
Yes. So this is the mid-19th century in America. Keep in mind, America is a relatively only decades old country. It is a young republic. It is this brand new revolutionary idea of democracy and freedom. And so America is really growing up and trying to separate itself in terms of the literature and the arts and education from Europe, from England. And so there's this new school of thought, the transcendentalists. And as you said, the center of that was Ralph Waldo Emerson. But he was really collecting around himself or attracting around himself these great, young, fresh American thinkers. And so he has Henry David Thoreau living upstairs in his home, serving as his handyman because Thoreau can't afford the rent. But Emerson recognizes that there's this great genius, this great writer in Thoreau. So he gives Thoreau a place to live. He's got the Alcotts living just up the street. He's paying Louisa May Alcott and her family's rent. He's got the Hawthorns just up the lane renting. He's paying their rent at the old man's. And he invites Margaret Fuller to plug into this group. And now keep in mind, Ralph Waldo Emerson said of Margaret Fuller that she was the radiant genius and fiery heart of their whole center. And as you said, we know all of the other names, but we don't know Margaret Fuller's. And that is stunning because Margaret Fuller is the first editor of the Dial magazine, as you said, which was this brand new, revolutionary, dangerous, very counterculture magazine that is going to be this new, fresh school of American thought, transcendentalism, the American counterpart or answer to the Romantics, the Romanticism movement that's happening over in Europe and in England. So Margaret is their first editor. Margaret is literally their leader, their chief, their muse. She writes more articles in the Dial than any of the others, including Emerson. So it's really stunning that her name is not as well known as the others as we've moved along through history by several hundred years.
Absolutely. And like you said earlier, too, she was the first woman permitted at Harvard in their library. She is the heartbeat of the Dial, which I thought was just absolutely beautiful. But we also see her craving more. She's providing inspiration. She's providing leadership. She's mentoring all these amazing people around her. But she does get a bit restless. She needs some adventure in her life. I personally think I was captivated even more by Margaret Fuller when she went abroad. She was assigned to go to Italy, like you said earlier, the first female foreign news correspondent, and she goes to Rome in 1847. Tell us about that time.
Oh my goodness. So I love how you put that because Margaret is in this unique moment in time in Concord, Massachusetts, but she's walking the shores of Walden Pond with Thoreau as he's debating a move out to the woods. And she's sitting by the river with Nathaniel Hawthorne, inspiring his character of Hester Prynne. But as you said, she wants more than just poetry. She wants more than just philosophy. She said, The problem with concord is that it's lacking in discord. Margaret wanted to get her hands dirty in the gritty work of moving humanity forward, of covering the writing of Frederick Douglass. She has a stop first in New York where she's writing for Greeley and Horace Greeley, the well-known thinker and abolitionist and newspaperman. And while she's there, she wants to visit the prisons. She wants to visit the orphanages. She wants to talk to female prostitutes, to ask them their stories as individuals. She wants more. And so eventually that leads her overseas to Europe, where Greeley sends her first to London and then to Paris, and then really where she lands and settles and where she feels that she's at last home and in a place where her true nature can blossom and flourish is Rome. And this is the time of the great revolutions. This is the year 1848 that revolutions swept across Europe. Monarchies everywhere were toppled in this spirit of democracy and this spirit of hope. And Margaret becomes a central figure in the Roman Revolution. She falls in love with a Roman count who is a soldier in the Roman Revolution. She takes him as a lover out of wedlock, very scandalous. She, as she's startled to discover, becomes pregnant with his child. It sparks an international scandal. This is why she's the inspiration for Hester Prynne, those of us who have read The Scarlet Letter. And then it really just even gets more juicy from there. And she has this epic time in her life of love and war and danger. And she's running from the authorities and she has this new husband and this new baby. And her life is just real. I was just thinking, oh my goodness, I could not make this up if I wanted to. This is just the juiciest raw material. History is the furthest thing from boring. And it was the perfect raw material to write a juicy novel.
Couldn't agree with you more. And also to add to that, which I just found incredibly fascinating. So not only was she surrounded by these American luminaries, she goes abroad and she's rubbing shoulders with Chopin. We have Wordsworth, we have Sand. There's just so much more. I feel like where this woman goes, things are happening. Like she has this magnetic effect, don't you think?
Oh, exactly. And I loved that so much. So as you said, Wordsworth, Georges Sand, Frédéric Chopin. And then something that I really loved was her friendship with Elizabeth Barrett Browning in Florence when Margaret is in Italy. And she just, she was attracted to, and I think also really intrigued and attracted to herself, also luminaries. And she was known as this sparkling, witty, unrivaled conversationalist. And she just loved to verbally and mentally spar with the great thinkers of her day. And so that made it really fun because you almost never know which great luminary from history is going to pop up as a supporting character in her story next. And that was really fun.
I also loved that we got different views of Margaret. So we got to see Margaret on her own. We saw Margaret kind of chasing the career and just life experience in itself. We also get to see Margaret as a mother, as a partner, and just being a part of Italy during a time of great revolution, being a part of America during a great time of change. And we just really see her as a multifaceted woman who has done so much and overcome so much. But again, prior to your book, Alison, I had no idea this woman existed. My question is, how did you find her? How did you find her? How did you stumble upon her story? And what was the decision like to put this into a book?
Yes. So Edgar Allan Poe said, humanity is divided into men, women, and Margaret Fuller. And Poe and Margaret Fuller were not always on the best of terms, which you can read about in the book, Finding Margaret Fuller. But when Poe said that comment about her, it was a backhanded compliment, begrudgingly made, because even he, who had been a huge critic of her, he'd called her Margaret Fuller. He had eviscerated her with his pen when he wrote in New York. And he was the toast of the town of New York when he met Margaret Fuller, because he was fresh off his success of The Raven. And so he really eviscerated Margaret. I don't think he appreciated what a strong fierce, independent woman he was. I don't think he appreciated what a strong, fierce, independent woman she was. And so that just gives you an idea, though, that even Poe had to admit that Margaret Fuller existed on a plane unto herself, the most well-read person in America, she was known as. And so central to Margaret's story, which you touched on, is this evolution, this propulsive move to find new challenges, to grow, to break down the next barrier, to just continue to push herself and grow and expand wherever she went, whoever she mingled with. And so I think it's stunning that we don't know her story, but I felt the same way as you. I didn't either. And what happened was I was reading a book of nonfiction on the genius cluster of the transcendentalists. And it was this moment in time with Emerson, Thoreau, Louisa May Alcott, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Margaret Fuller was the other character in this book. It was a nonfiction biography book. And Margaret jumped off the page at me. I knew about every other person there. I'd read the work multiple times in some cases of the other people in there. I'd read books about their lives, but I had never heard of Margaret Fuller. And I thought, she is the most fascinating, interesting one of them all. Her life is the most dramatic and epic. That is the story I want to write. That is the next woman that I want to put into a book. And I knew I had met my next heroine and I had met my next book. And that's just what happens. It just, the story, I get bitten. It just, the story gets its hooks into me. And so when I discovered her story, but also just this moment in time, it was the story behind the story that was so tantalizing and intriguing to me, because we all know their books, we all know their names, but they were all friends. They were all rivals. They were living together. They were falling in and out of love. They were falling in and out of friendship. And so I thought, I want to tell the story behind the story of this great moment in time. And Margaret is undoubtedly the leading lady.
I just love hearing it's like it was meant to happen. And I think you just, again, did a fabulous job of telling her life story and just showing that, hey, we should know her just as much as we know the Emersons and the Thoreaus and the Alcotts. But I have a question to ask, because I'm like, okay, now I've read this book. I know a bit about Margaret Fuller. I think you might have a bit more insight than I do. So my question is, what do you think Margaret would have done had she lived a longer life? Because I'm here saying, man, she's done so much in her lifetime. Can you imagine if she had lived a longer life? So what do you think Margaret would have done?
Yes. So to me, that is the great tragedy of this story. I'm not spoiling anything here because it's in the prologue and you will see it, and then you'll hopefully be intrigued to see how it happens. But Margaret died very young, at the age of 40, in a horrific shipwreck. She was so close to the shore of Long Island. She was so close to the shores of New York State that the people on land could hear the people on the ship crying out for help. They were stuck on a sandbar during a hurricane. And it's just a tragedy because that was the summer. Margaret was sailing home with her new husband and her new baby from having just survived the Roman Revolution. She was coming back to America, having been offered the position to preside over the first meeting of the National Women's Rights Movement when they were to meet that fall in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1850. Instead of Margaret serving as president and banging the gavel to kick off everything that would come, the convention started with a moment of silence in Margaret's honor. And to me, that moment of silence is just, it says so much about how her voice was lost. And we cannot know, we can only imagine, we can only daydream about what it would have meant to have had Margaret's voice in the women's rights movement. She was mentor to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Her book, Woman in the 19th Century, was considered the founding document of the women's rights movement, the suffrage movement for women's right to vote. Margaret spoke out about the women's rights to be educated, to not only vote, but to have property that wasn't just automatically the property of her husband, or greater rights for her children, for her mind, for her thoughts, for her body, for her purpose. And so to me, I can't help but be sad when I reflect on just the fact that her life was lost. When I imagine what her voice might have done in the tumultuous decade of the 1850s leading us up to the Civil War, what she would have done for the cause of abolitionism. We also know that she was sailing back that summer of 1850 with what she considered to be the greatest work of her life, which was her manuscript on the Roman Revolution. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, her friend who had known her as she was writing it back in Italy, and Emerson, her confidant back home, who she was corresponding with via letters the whole time she was gone, they all agreed that it was the great work of her life. And not only was Margaret's life lost at sea during the shipwreck, but so was that great work. And so that's a huge piece of why my book is called Finding Margaret Fuller. It is unearth her legacy, her life story, and just so much of what was lost when her life was cut tragically short.
It really, I think, is a great loss. I was a bit sad reading that prologue, but you're absolutely right. It will make readers want to figure who was this woman and what happened to her. But I know I might have a listener who's saying, okay, great. This woman sounds good. On paper, she knew all the great people back in the day. But the real question is, how has Margaret's legacy shaped modern society? If you could throw in your 2 cents to say, I get it, she was a woman of her time, she defied all the odds, she knew all these amazing people, she did great work. This is one effect it had on our modern society today. What would you say?
Margaret was the first woman to ask the question, why must there be a man's role in society, a man's job, a man's place in the household and in the larger world versus a woman's role in society, a woman's place in the home, a woman's place in the workforce? Why are there male characteristics and female characteristics? She said, let them be sea captains if that be their calling. She was referring to a woman's right to use her mind, to use her talent, to follow her passion. Her life was a singular testimony to that rallying cry just by breaking down barriers, petitioning the president of Harvard to allow her to study there as the first woman to study there, becoming the first female editor of the Dial, becoming the first newspaper woman to be paid like a man and to cover overseas and New York City and everywhere in between. Her life stood as the testimony to it, and then she inspired countless other women to do the same. She fired the opening volley on the argument on why women not only could, but should seek more, ask for more, do more, expect more. And that is a mission that is still playing out to this day. I'm a mother of 3 daughters. We just celebrated Women's History Month. I love that there is this push for her story in addition to history. And Margaret, in so many ways, can be the banner carrier for all of us as we celebrate women in the past, present, and the future.
Absolutely. I love hearing you say that. And I have to say, I agree with Poe. It's men, women, and Margaret Fuller. So I really hope listeners will give Finding Margaret Fuller a read. Truly, I think you'll look at life a lot differently and you'll appreciate this woman so much. And you'll be so happy to get to know her a bit through the pages of Allison's book. But, oh my gosh, where does the time go? There's so much I want to ask you. But the one thing I've noticed with all your books is that you center strong women. So for listeners, if you're not familiar with Allison, one of my favorites is The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post, Where the Light Falls, The Queen's Fortune. She has 3 other novels, 2 children's books, a memoir. But I want to focus on the novels.
Yes.
What would you say is the similarities, but the differences between your books?
I love telling the stories of women who have been forgotten or who are lesser known than they ought to be. And in every case, it's a woman where you might look at her and think, take Margaret Fuller or take Marjorie Post. They're gifted with great talent, great intelligence. Margaret knew enough from writing about women who could barely feed their children or women who are working in factories or women who are working as prostitutes. Margaret knew she was a privileged woman and that she had food to eat. She had a roof over her head. She had a singular mind, the sharpest brain you could argue of her time. And yet it wasn't easy for her. With Marjorie Post, she had all the money in the world. She was the heiress of the cereal empire. And yet it wasn't easy for her. With Desiree Clary, she was Napoleon's first love. She goes on to marry the King of Sweden. And yet it wasn't easy for her. These are women who are inhabiting these moments in time where they are not only on the front lines of history viewing it, but they are actively participating in and shaping and leading. And these are women who are thrust into these unbelievable circumstances, who rise to the occasion, and yet their stories are less well known than they should be. And we know so much of the history from the perspectives of men. I want to go back and shine the light on the women who were there and to tell their stories.
And that's why I love reading your books, because I want to know the women of the time. We've heard enough from the men. So it feels good to hear their stories and that you're providing a platform for them and introducing us again to these women, because I will forever say, thanks to you, I know who Margaret Fuller is.
Found her.
We found her. Exactly. Finding Margaret Fuller. I found her and I'm glad to know her. We're greedy here on this show. So we always want to know, one, what our authors are reading, but also if they're working on any other books. So before I get your book recommendations, are you working on any other projects? Anything you can share?
I am. I'm working on another leading lady from history, another historical fiction. She will be an American again this time. And this time we will travel to the 20th century. So a little more relatively recent, sexy, scandalous. It involves a big crime, the crime of the century. And I'm going to leave it at that just as a teaser, because I'm going to share the news very soon who my next leading lady is. But I am knee deep in it and loving it.
Listeners, if you're like me and you're curious, just keep your eyes peeled to AllisonPataki.com. I'm sure she'll be sharing there first. And yes, I'm excited. I can't wait. But I want to hear about your reading life too. So share with our listeners the last book or books that you finished reading that you'd now recommend.
Absolutely. So I love historical fiction, and that as a writer, but also as a reader, because it can, to me, can be not only entertaining, a great story, but also educational. I love walking away feeling as though while I was being immersed into a great story, I was also learning a thing or two. And so I love historical fiction for that reason. So I'm really excited to read next Marie Benedict's book, Queens of Crime. It's an advanced copy because I'm reading it for a cover quote. So that is next on my to read pile. Currently, in this exact moment, I'm reading The Mystery Guest by Nita Prose. It is the follow-up to her smash hit, The Maid, which I loved, set in the English hotel of the Regency Grand. It's a little bit of a mystery. And the most recent one that I loved was Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt, which was just so original and creative and fun and heartwarming. I loved the characters.
Yes, I love that one too. What was your favorite childhood book that you can remember?
I have to say a few because I truly can't pick one. I adored and still adore The Velveteen Rabbit. I read that with my children and I just can't read it without bawling, crying. I would say The Velveteen Rabbit, The Wind in the Willows. I love to read that every spring with my children as we feel the stirrings of the new season. I loved always reading anything about Ramona, and I loved the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I love C.S. Lewis.
I love C.S. Lewis too. He's great. Okay, so on the show, we also love indie bookstores. So share with our listeners some of your favorite local indies.
Absolutely. So I love Split Rock Books in upstate New York, in Cold Spring, New York. I worked with them on a pre-sale campaign for Finding Margaret Fuller, and it's just such a wonderful bookstore. I also recently visited An Unlikely Story in Plainville, Massachusetts, and that is an incredible bookstore. Just such an engaged, enthusiastic community of readers, such a beautiful space, such a welcoming environment to welcome visiting authors and readers of all ages. And I spent a good amount of time living in Chicago. So I love out there the Bookseller in Winnetka, and I love Lake Forest Bookstore also out in the Chicagoland area. And I've never been, but I've done virtual events with, and I love the staff and the readers there. And I'm going there this month and I just can't wait. Foxtail Bookshop in Georgia.
Hey, thank you so much for sharing. We love our indies here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're great places. They host great events and they sell wonderful books.
Thank you, booksellers. We love you.
Yes, thank you. Getting back to your book, Finding Margaret Fuller, and just tying things together. Look, I know you've done your job, you've written the book, and now it's up to us readers to hopefully read this one, discuss it with a friend, and share our thoughts. But what are you hoping for in an ideal world that readers might think or feel, or what discussions you're hoping they might have after they've turned the last page?
I hope readers will come away from reading Finding Margaret Fuller feeling inspired. They will see the barriers, obstacles, challenges that Margaret faced in her lifetime as a woman in the moment in time in which she lived. And yet they will see the talent, energy, creativity, passion, resilience, perseverance with which she approached every obstacle. I hope that readers will feel like how Margaret Fuller wanted her readers to feel, that there is no mountain too high to climb, that they can and will face the challenges of the day, and that we each have a role to play in making the world a better place for all. I just hope that readers will feel like it was an immersive, transportive story. I feel like we all need to be inspired in this day and age. And I hope that they will feel like, wow, I learned something about this amazing woman, and I feel inspired and rejuvenated in my own life by seeing her example.
Absolutely. Feel inspired, rejuvenated, hopeful for the future, and the fact that we too can make a difference. Alison, thank you so much for coming on the show and speaking with me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy reading to everyone.
Thank you so much for listening to the Reader's Couch podcast. Please subscribe to the show, share it with a friend, and take a few seconds to leave a rating and review. Until next time, stay lounging, stay reading, and whenever you're in doubt, go straight to your local bookstore or library. Thanks again for listening, and happy reading.